Hey, what's up, everyone? So today I'm going to be giving a brief lecture on decision making and how decision making is different between individuals and groups and how it's different. And we'll cover in a little bit more detail some information from one of the articles you read for this week. But I'm just going to start by having you reflect on the following scenario. Right, so just read this passage about Helen. Okay, so now make your response to this question. So just imagine that you're advising Helen on what to do and just indicate the lowest probability of the novel being accepted that you would consider acceptable for Helen to invest the time in writing the novel. And only, in other words, Helen should only attempt to write this novel if the chances of it getting published are at least what? And note that you can see that a 10 out of 10 probability meaning would mean that she shouldn't really take much of a risk, and that a 1 in 10 chance that the novel would be accepted, that response would indicate that she's taking a high level of risk with her time. Okay, so now that you have your response, imagine what would happen if you were placed in a group with others and you had to come to a consensus on what level, the probability of the novel being accepted. You had to, only one answer can come from the group. What do you think would happen? Well, so early group behavior psychologists were very interested in this. And what they found, early studies found, that groups tend to shift towards making more risky decisions, right? And so they basically did this exercise. They had individuals indicate their answers, and that Helen scenario was one, right, while they were alone. And then they would get into a group and they would discuss their opinions with each other. And what they found was that the group opinion on the whole was more risky than the average individual member, right? And so this was termed, it's called the risky shift, which indicates that a group consensus is almost always going to favor more risk than the average decision made by all of the individuals in the group prior to their group interaction. So that they've done this with other scenarios as well. They would have people make bets on things, wager money alone or in a group, and found that groups tended to shift towards risk. They've made bets with smaller probabilities of winning, in other words, riskier bets. And also they tended to make larger bets. They also discovered a key boundary condition to this risky shift, and that's that they can't just be in the presence of each other. There has to be communication between the group members for the shift to be observed. So why is this? Well, there was an early hypothesis that they called it the risk as value hypothesis, which is kind of like an extension of the central theme of social identity theory, which suggests that we want to be good group members. We want to appear like we are good, we have the right opinions, the good opinions, because we get a sense of esteem off of being a valued member in the groups to which we belong. And so the risk as value hypothesis essentially suggests that that risk in our culture tends to be a valued property, right? And so when in a group context, when people have some degree of esteem or self presentation concerns, that they may bias their decision towards this increased level of risk as a mechanism to gain, status and approval from the people in the group. But later research kind of threw a wrench into this, and you'll probably see, that this work, as most psychological science, it's not as easy and straightforward as people initially thought. Just think about last week when we were talking about performance and how, the role of competition and the role of arousal and the attention theories and all of this science. The people are kind of trying to find moderators, or trying to kind of hone in on what the mechanisms of action are that drive these effects. And so here there was shortly after the risky shift became very popular and a large topic of research, many experiments demonstrated that there was actually a shift towards caution under certain circumstances after group discussion. And so this led obviously to inconsistent results, right? Sometimes groups tend to make riskier decisions than individuals, while other times they tend to be more cautious, as a group. And so this really pulled the rug out from under the risk as value hypothesis as the driving mechanism of this phenomenon. Later research kind of went beyond the risky shift and suggested that the risky shift really isn't about risk. So what happened was they started exploring the conditions under which people were more cautious or more risky. And what was kind of born out of this work is a phenomenon known as group polarization, right? And so group polarization basically suggests that when the group gets together and discusses, it's going to strengthen the average inclination of the individual group members, right? So if people tended to lean towards caution, the group interaction will push them more in the direction of caution. If it tended towards risk, then the discussion is going to strengthen that tendency towards risk. So it's not so much about it being only risky or only cautious. It's about where the individual average inclination begins, and the group just magnifies it or amplifies the strength of the bias in either direction. So here's an example. One of the earlier studies on group polarization by Moscovici examined French students' attitudes towards Americans, which were negative at the time, and towards de Gaulle, who was a political figure in France, and younger people tended to have a positive view of this politician. And so what they found was, as you would expect from group polarization, that attitudes towards Americans became more negative after the discussion than before. But attitudes toward de Gaulle became more positive after the discussion than before. So what explains this group polarization phenomenon? Well, there's kind of three hypotheses behind this. One is known as group decision rules. The second is known as social comparisons. And the third is informational influence. And so let's just unpack these briefly. So what are group decision rules? Well, this is kind of like a statistical explanation. It's like when say you have a group of, 5 people, and 4 of them have a very positive attitude towards some outcome, but one of them skews that distribution and is an outlier and has a negative view. Well, maybe whenever they are discussing something in the group, that person who's skewing the mean, right, or skewing the whole group's output, right, is going to kind of come in a little bit, right? And so it's a statistical explanation about why you would see this polarization phenomenon. The 4 people are going to overrule the 1 person in the ultimate final group decision. For the explanation of social comparison suggests that most decisions involve social values, such as caring for others, being adventurous, taking health risks, and that this is kind of the social identity theory explanation, right? That prior to discussion, people have this sense that they're farther towards this favorable pole. If it's a good thing, they rate it good, and if it's a bad thing, they rate it bad. But when they get into a group, they see that other people might be more extreme towards the favorable decision than they are. And as a consequence, they might adjust and kind of come closer to that extreme. And so basically during the discussion, people realize that others might endorse the position farther towards the socially desirable pole than them. And this is going to lead them to change their opinion. Right. So here we can see, right, that when people are more motivated to move to the socially desirable end of the scale, right, you can see like a person might have started with a rating of like 7, but after group discussion, they come in and to the more socially desirable response of 9. The last thing is probably the most obvious explanation, which is informational influence. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's that people are influenced by the content of the group discussion, that people hear arguments that might be in opposing directions, arguments that might be particularly persuasive or original. And that new information drives the change in their opinion, right? And so people polarize when they're exposed to persuasive arguments from other group members. And this tends to strengthen the dominant tendency in the group. So just reflect for a minute, like which of those mechanisms do you think is most convincing? Do you think there might be any other mechanisms at play that explain group polarization? And how might you be able to reverse polarization effects? And is there a way that you could use this polarization phenomenon to your advantage in some way? So next, we're going to kind of connect this work on group performance or on decision making with the content from group performance that we reviewed a couple weeks ago. So just a quick refresher, social facilitation basically means when other people are around, this leads to an increase in physiological arousal, which is going to facilitate or improve performance on problems that are well-learned or habitual or automatic, dominant responses. But it's going to impair performance on tasks that are not well-learned or therefore difficult, like coming up with, complex philosophical arguments, right? The presence of others is going to impair that. So social facilitation occurs when people are working alone, but in the presence of an audience, right? So in other words, they're not working alongside with other people on a task. In other work, which is related to, I mean, it's related to performance. You could put this in the performance category, but it's also involved in the process of decision-making. So one study, it was mentioned in one of your papers, is this Ringelmann study, where basically they played classical tug of war. And what they were kind of getting at is whether or not social facilitation would be observed when people were working as a member of a team. So for example, pulling a rope, that's a pretty automatic default response. I mean, you're not dealing with some highly complex, cognitive task here. It's a matter of pull hard, right? And so they had, varying group sizes, play tug of war, and assessed, how much pull they had. Now, if social facilitation is correct, then what you would expect is that whenever other people are present, you're going to pull harder, right, on this simple task. So what they found was kind of perplexing in this study. They found that when people were alone, they pulled with 85 kilograms of pressure, right? So what that's just an individual's performance. When there were 7 people, the average performance across all 7 people was 65 kilograms. And when there was 14 people, it was even lower. It was 61 kilograms, right? And so what this shows is that in contrast to social facilitation, what we're seeing on this tug of war study is that when people are in groups, they decrease their performance, especially when a task is an additive task, right? Where everyone has to contribute to the outcome. So this is odd, right? Because it doesn't fit with the idea of social facilitation. And so they termed this social loafing. And so other studies began to emerge on the social loafing phenomenon to try to tease out what the mechanisms were at play in this phenomenon. And so one of them was an article that you read for this week, which is by Bib Latané and Kip Williams. You should be familiar with those names, I'd imagine. Bib Latané was the person who came up with the bystander effect. And Kipling Williams was the person who did a lot of the cyberball ostracism work, right? And so very early on, they were involved in a lot of this social loafing research. So in Many Hands Make Light the Work, there were 2 studies here. And what they were really asking is, does social loafing occur because people are trying less hard? They're like giving up, or they're kind of not putting in the effort? Or is it just because the nature of the task demands precise coordination, right? So you can think of this like, if everyone kind of pulls in bursts, right? If everyone's pulling, but they're pulling at different times, it's going to make it seem like the pressure is always lower than if it's just an individual. You would have to be perfectly coordinated so that everyone was pulling at their maximum strength at precisely the same time. And this isn't, an alternative explanation. It's an attempt to explain away the phenomenon of social loafing, rather than it being that in the presence of others, people are loafing and giving up and not putting in the effort. Maybe it's just that they're less coordinated and they're trying just as hard. So in the first study, the yelling study, the independent variable was they had people alone, or they had people in pseudo groups, or they had people in groups. Well, what is this distinction, right? Whenever they were alone, right, they were told through headphones, right? They were wearing these headphones, they couldn't hear outside, and they were told, we want you to scream, or we want you to be silent, right? In the pseudo group, they were told, you're going to be screaming with everyone else. And all these people were blindfolded as well, right? So they couldn't see if other people were actually screaming. But they were told, you're going to scream with everyone else now. But really, they were screaming alone, right? And then in the third one, everyone screamed together. Again, they were wearing earphones and blindfolds, so they could not see each other or hear each other. So the dependent variable was the amount of sound pressure that they created. And the question was, under what conditions would people yell the loudest? Was it when they were alone, whenever they were actually in a group, or whenever they just thought they were in a group, right? So here you can tease apart, right, by comparing the pseudo group to the group, whether or not there actually is diminished effort. Because in the pseudo group, there really isn't any coordination loss, right? You're just partialing out that coordination loss. Okay, so here's the data from this study, right? And you can see that when group size increases, the amount of sound that the people create decreases, right? So when they're yelling alone, a group of one, they're cheering at almost 5. But whenever they think they're in a group of 6, you're seeing, it cut almost in half how loud they are. So you can think of this also, like, this happens in everyday life, right? Think about if it's someone's birthday and there's 2 people singing happy birthday versus 10 people singing happy birthday. How loud do you sing, right? So you can see there might be this kind of implicit, like, loafing phenomenon. That's what these people are trying to figure out, right? Is it because they're actually reducing their effort, or is it because they're not singing precisely at the same time? So this first study, there's an experimental compound. The problem may not be the reduction of individual effort, but the poor coordination between the members of the group. This is also the case in the rope study, right? So they need to, in order to determine that this is actual loafing or reduced effort, they have to rule out the alternative explanation that there is coordination loss happening. And so in the Ringelmann study, subjects were made to think they were pulling together when in fact they were pulling alone. And what they found was that subjects reduced their effort when they were tricked into thinking that they were working as a team when they were actually working alone, right? But this did not rule out coordination loss. Latin A did. Latin A, with their 3-level independent variable, were able to demonstrate that a good portion of the variance in that loafing was due to coordination loss, right? But there was still loafing going on. It explained away, it was part of the reason, but it wasn't the only reason. Social loafing still emerged, which very, very interesting phenomenon. So just to kind of recap this, what is social loafing? Well, in principle, it is that as group size increases on a task where the task is additive and group people are working together, as the group size increases, individuals will reduce their effort, right? So they lower their contribution as more people are there to contribute. I'm sure all of you are aware of this after having taken research methods. However, nothing is ever as straightforward as you'd like. Sometimes studies have shown an opposite pattern of results predicted by social facilitation theory, right? So sometimes the presence of others facilitates performance, but other times it causes loafing. What's going on here? You can't have both. What's the mechanism that distinguishes between social loafing and social facilitation? Well, if you go back and you look at Zientz's original drive theory, you can see that social facilitation occurs because arousal is increased. But with social loafing, right, there's reduced arousal, right? When you're in a situation in which being in a group makes you relaxed as you perform, right, you have the opposite effect of social facilitation, right? So if you're the one pulling alone, the heat is all on you. The physiological arousal is going to be higher. But when you can blend into the crowd and no one will know or be able to identify that you are not contributing at your highest level, it makes you relax as you perform and you will loaf. You can fade into the crowd. It decreases the dominant response. So let's think of some examples of this, right? So one example is when you're doing a group project where you're all given one group grade, right? How many of you have been in a group project and there's someone who's socially loafing and not contributing their fair share? I'd imagine every single person who's been involved in a group project. If you were clapping in a crowd, if it's a really, really big crowd, you'll probably clap less than if you're one of 2 or 3 people. We already mentioned this, singing happy birthday. But all of these are situations when you can de-individuate, right? When you can blend in and aren't identifiable, when you fade into the crowd. And so what we get here is, drive theory now kind of explaining not just social facilitation and effects, right? That arousal is the mechanism that leads to social facilitation, but that the absence of arousal leads to the opposite, to social loafing, to, lower performance. So when would it be social facilitation? It would be social facilitation on a very highly arousing situation, when you're taking exams or shooting baskets, right? But it isn't, whoop, I'm sorry. I don't know why I can't nab that. But it isn't it's not social facilitation, it's social loafing whenever arousal is reduced because you're blending into the crowd. Okay, so here's kind of like a point-by-point map, right? So we have the presence of other people, and whenever others are evaluating your performance, in other words, whenever you are identifiable, right? This is going to increase alertness, evaluation apprehension, distraction, right? This increases physiological arousal, which makes people perform better on easy tasks, well-learned tasks, and worse on difficult tasks. That is social facilitation. However, whenever the presence of others, whenever you're not being evaluated, right? There is no evaluation apprehension, right? There's less distraction. You need to be less alert. As a consequence, there's lower arousal. And what you get is the opposite of social facilitation, where easy tasks, performance is impaired, and on difficult tasks, performance is improved. So what can we do to counteract the tendency to loaf, right? Well, we can, this is important because, much of our time in the workplace and school is spent in collaboration with others trying to be productive. And so we want to definitely, figure out mechanisms to reduce poor performance due to social loafing. One key way is to increase identifiability, right? So people are going to be motivated when they believe that their contribution is identifiable, that the teacher or the boss or whoever, right, is able to see what their contribution was and see it as separate from others, right? And so one way you can do this is you can formally divide tasks, you can assign roles, you can specifically measure each individual's contribution. And another thing, just from the outset, is you can make groups smaller, right? Just by making smaller groups, you're going to have less loafing. So you can see this, I mean, in experiments have tested this, right? So looking at sports teams, football coaches, for example, will individually film and evaluate each player. And this ensures that they're not going to loaf. At the same time, if you ask just everyday people to shout louder when each group member is wearing a microphone, right, and they know they're being recorded, their personal output will be, they'll be louder, right, because they know that they're being measured, right? So it's pretty solid evidence that just by making each person's contribution identifiable will reduce social loafing. Another thing that's quite interesting is that there are cross-cultural differences in social loafing. So Early et al. Found that people in individualistic cultures, and then specifically in this study, Americans, engaged in social loafing much more than people in collectivist cultures, in this study, the Chinese. And this is because accountability reduced loafing in American groups, but it didn't reduce it in Chinese groups. So here's the data. You can look and see, the blue bars are when people were working alone, and the green bars are when they were in a group. Right? You could look at the United States. Look at that horrible performance. Whenever you're in an individualistic culture and you're looking out for yourself, right, you're more likely to engage in social loafing, which suggests that there's a degree of motivated processing going on here. Of self-relevant concerns are often driving this, but this isn't the case in more collectivist cultures, right, like Israel and China. So let's just kind of apply this, right? Because, up to this point, we've been dealing with kind of silly, yelling or, singing happy birthday or shouting, but let's look at real world situations, because I think what you're going to find is surprising. I mean, most people love the idea of brainstorming, right? And it's used and implemented almost everywhere. Let's get together and come up with ideas about things. This is really bad, in fact, unless certain criteria are applied, right? So, different organizations are going to use brainstorming, but what they're actually doing is impairing the amount of ideas that they're going to get, right? So the goal of brainstorming, right, is to come up with as many ideas as possible in a set amount of time. But whenever you're in groups, social loafing is going to occur. You see this over and over, right? So as the group size increases, the number of ideas generated, it does increase. But when you look at the average, right, how many ideas per group member are generated, it decreases. Right? So why is this? Part of it could be social loafing. However, another thing is coordination loss. In this context, specific to brainstorming, it's often called production blocking, right? And this is, that it's the idea that people aren't all coming up with ideas together because they're waiting to talk, they're listening to other people, and so they're not coordinated. They're not all firing ideas out on all cylinders. And so production blocking is just another it's a more specific term for a type of coordination loss. And so you can see here that production blocking does explain a substantial proportion of why brainstorming is impaired. So how do you fix this? Well, the best thing that you could do is you could have people come together in a group and then have them work independently first. Have them come up with ideas before they come back into the group, right? Have them work as individuals to generate as many ideas as possible. Brainstorm alone, then come together and share everyone's ideas, right? That's going to give you, that's going to be a beneficial way to brainstorm. But unfortunately, not many places actually implement it that way. So I hope this was interesting. You know, I'm trying to kind of build some scaffolding here, linking these different areas from decision-making to performance, and show how some of these early social psychological theories of group behavior kind of really weave in and out of different topic areas and can explain a multitude of phenomenon of interest to the student of group behavior. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope you enjoyed the readings, and have a great remainder of your day.